Hello again, everybody. Welcome again to the Adult Autism, a Spectrum of Uniqueness podcast. Today, I am joined by Savannah Oxenham. And Savannah, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, thank you. Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. So excited.
Well, yeah, and as the audience can tell, at least from the way I see it, you have an accent. You might think I have an accent, but
Yeah,
um, so tell us who you are, where you're located, what you do for a living.
yeah. Okay, so I'm Savannah or Sav. I'm from Wales in the United Kingdom, so that's where my accent comes from.
Okay.
I live with my partner and our little girl who is actually autistic herself. She's 2.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. So I work in children's residential at the moment, children in foster care. So it's a very rewarding job, very difficult, but very rewarding as well. I actually found out I was autistic at university.
Oh,
So I'd never actually sort of even thought I'd worked with children with additional needs for years, and I never actually thought of autism in terms of myself. And my disability mentor at university for mental health stuff like depression and anxiety, she just turned to me one day and she said, "Hey, have you ever looked at autism?" And I was like, no, like not for myself. Like, I'd worked with children and adults with quite severe autism and learning disabilities, and that just wasn't something. And then she did the little AQ10 test with me, like the 10
yeah.
questions,
Hmm.
and I scored 10 out of 10.
Wow.
Um, so yeah, I went and did
Congratulations.
yeah, I know. So I went and did some research from that, and she referred me for the assessment and everything. But the more I researched about autism, especially in girls, that was something that really clicked then. And I
Yeah.
was like, oh, that just like gives me the answer to like my entire life as to why I thought, wondered why I was so different.
Yeah.
So yeah,
And I think a
yeah,
lot of people have that question. What, they recognize that, I just wasn't the same as some of the other
yeah,
kids or most of the other kids when I was growing up. I wasn't quite sure why. And then they go through the evaluation process and they start putting the pieces to the puzzle together to start understanding themselves, and then starts their discovery process and just kind of looking at
yeah,
their past experiences through a new autism lens. And it's
yeah,
it's
definitely.
yeah, it's a neat thing though when that finally happens.
Yeah,
So today we wanted to talk to you about stimming because
yeah,
I think it was a video that you had done on stimming in the past and wasn't quite sure. I don't know a lot about that. I know I work with autistic people and they have their own ways that they stim and about that. But I just wanted to start off by just talk about what is stimming, and if you could just kind of describe what that looks like for you in your life as an autistic person.
yeah. So I'd say once I got diagnosed, it became more not like prevalent, but it was something that I didn't hide as much. Like
Yes.
throughout my whole life, it was more like the subtle type stimming, like the constant fidgeting, which is something in everyday life I find I do now. Because I masked, obviously, like I wasn't diagnosed until I was 20, so my up until then, my whole life was sort of I just masked, like I just
Yeah.
tried to fit in and be typical.
Yep.
So my stimming came out in ways that were seen as more accepted, like the constant fidgeting, like the pulling your hair, like those sort of things. And now I do find that it's mostly in like heightened emotion. So if I'm very anxious or very upset, the stimming comes out in more self-injurious type stimming, so like the rocking like against like
Yeah.
walls, or hand biting, those sort of things. And then if I'm very excited or something makes me very happy, like the hand flapping. But throughout day-to-day life, it's I'm always doing something with my hands. I'm always like rocking my leg, or like even slightly rocking in a chair. Like so it is like being more aware of that now as well.
Yeah.
Like yeah, and knowing like the causes of that and how it makes me feel. Yeah.
And I know that some people will have like their go-to stims, things that they really rely on, things that seem to really do the best to help
Yeah.
them settle down. Other people, it doesn't really, there's not one particular one that works better than another. Do you have a go-to stim, something that really you can rely on that really seems to work
Yeah.
with
I
you?
think rocking, I find it
Yeah.
quite soothing, quite regulating. And even if I'm in a very like busy situation or there's a lot of people, so I'm more aware of and self-conscious about masking in those circumstances, even like the little gentle rock is something that still feel comfortable
Yeah.
using and like going to. And I find that quite a common one, especially working with children and adults with varying disabilities and stuff. My little girl does a lot of rocking as well, and I think it's just very regulating for the
Hmm.
system. Yeah.
Yeah. And you said that that would normally happen if you're kind of feeling anxious or uptight
Yeah.
about something. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Especially like high anxiety situations, a lot of people, a lot of noise, like in day-to-day life,
Yes.
can be quite overstimulating.
Was there, kind of looking back at your life, was there ever a time when you felt like you had to hide your stimming and because people will do that. And I've had clients who have said, I didn't want anybody to see that I stimmed, but did you do that? And how did that affect you if you did?
Yeah, definitely, especially not being diagnosed till later on. It was not having that like knowledge of why I was doing stuff. And if I did start
Yeah.
stimming, I was like, oh well, that's weird because nobody else does that, so I can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
Not having an answer to certain behaviors and things definitely, I think, made me hide it more and suppress it. And it's still something I struggle with now sometimes, like because I've gone for so long having to mask and I've learned how to cope by masking even now I do find it quite hard and will hide my stimming, especially out in public or if there's a lot of people or people I'm not familiar with. If I've done training courses recently with people in a new job and I'm quite
Mm-hmm.
self-conscious about possibly stimming and stuff like that. So even now I'm trying to learn to like let that mask come down and let it fade a bit. But definitely like I do find um, once I got that diagnosis and started learning how stimming helps,
Yeah.
and safe stims as well, because obviously the self-interest stimming is like something my brain can't control. But now that I'm aware of autism and how it affects me, I can work on stims that help me regulate so that I don't explode as much, if that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
What's Yeah, I'm curious, what's the reason that you felt like in the past you had to hide your stimming, or even now, I guess too, that happens, but
I
what do
think
you think that's all about?
I think it's the worry of getting judged,
Yeah.
like by people around you, like them not understanding. We've come a long way with autism and understanding, neurodiversity and things like that, but still in everyday life, I think it's like, oh, well, no one else is doing that, so, I
Right.
can't do that. Like it, just that worry that it's not going to be accepted or people will think you're strange.
Yeah, what's wrong with
Yeah.
you? Yeah,
Yeah, it's
exactly.
really hmm. It's
What
interesting to me. Sorry. But now my little girl's got diagnosed. With her, we're kind of like, I'm just like, you do your thing, you do what makes you happy, who cares? What anyone else thinks.
Yeah.
Like you're you. If that's what's regulating her, that's like stimulating her wherever. I can see that from the outside looking onto her. But when it comes to me, I'm like, oh, but like people are gonna think I'm weird or
Yeah.
I feel quite anxious about that, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, and I hope
Yeah.
we get to a point as the younger ones are growing up that it becomes more acceptable,
Yeah.
that it's not seen as a negative thing or as a bad thing or you're weird or anything like that, that it's just, it's just something your daughter does. And if she
Yeah,
needs to do that, she does that. It'll be nice if we can get to that point.
definitely.
Have
Yeah.
have you noticed, Savannah, if your stimming changes depending on your emotions, like if you're, I don't know, excited or overwhelmed or you're trying to concentrate? Anything like that that you've noticed?
Yeah, definitely. I think when I'm trying to concentrate, especially in training type situations or work situations, it's more fidgeting, even sitting at a desk, like shaking my knee, those sort of things.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely when I'm upset or anxious, the more negative stimming, I would say, starts to come out, like the more stimming that could be quite dangerous, in terms of like hitting yourself into
Okay.
objects. Obviously the biting, like because it just starts building and then sometimes leads to meltdown.
Yeah.
Um, if I'm excited, it's more like vocal noises, like hand flapping more,
Mm.
I'd say like it appears more childlike.
Okay.
Yeah, but they definitely change based off my emotions, and I think it's like an expression of that emotion, like to help me cope with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why do you think they change? It's an interesting thing
Yeah.
that almost custom stims for different
Mm.
emotions. Any
Yeah.
ideas why that's the case?
I'm not sure. I think maybe because the emotion inside is like a certain stim will help that emotion. So if I'm feeling very
Yeah.
anxious, um, rocking or those sort of things seem to help more. When I'm excited, I'm not trying to regulate myself. It's just an expression, so it's just coming out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas the more negative emotions are causing stims that are trying to get me to regulate, trying to get me to cope so that I don't explode into meltdown. But then if a meltdown happens, obviously the stims become a lot more frequent. It's very interesting because like in meltdowns and stuff, I go non like I can't speak. So I
Yeah.
think the stimming sort of exaggerates more because of the non-verbal communication because I can't verbally get anything out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, and you wonder how much of this is just a nature type of thing versus
Yeah,
something that you've kind of over the years you've kind of learned that, oh, if I do this, then the consequence is I really
yeah,
can sort of regulate myself. This one seems to work better in this situation. You kind of wonder, about
yeah, that's true. Yeah,
that kind of stuff.
it is
Well,
very interesting.
how do people around you, I don't know, respond when you stim?
Mm,
And maybe that's changed if a person knows, like maybe your partner, they know you, who you are,
yeah.
and to them, maybe it's not a big deal. But how do people react to you stimming?
I think people around me now just see it as normal. They're just like, yeah, that's Sav. She's doing her thing.
Yeah.
Especially my partner and stuff like that. I think new people are a little bit like, oh, this is, like I think it depends on their understanding as well.
Yeah.
What experience they've had with neurodiversity, in their life, like, and they might have come across stimming before, and they're kind of like, okay, yeah, and just sort of
Yeah.
like leave you to it. I think now, like after my diagnosis, it's a little bit more accepting. People are like, okay, well, like Sav has autism, so this is this. But I know, like before my diagnosis, like growing up as a child, I always did a lot of stimming, and I didn't know that's what it was at the
Mm-hmm.
time. But people always said, like my parents and that, like, oh, don't do that, like that's, stop, that's
Yes.
irritating, that's weird.
Exactly.
Trying to get me to suppress it, like,
Right.
and now I have the answer to that. It's like, well, that's part of me.
That's just
Like,
who you are. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. But that's a good point that you make that I think a lot of parents will do that, don't do that. What will people think of you? And
yeah,
you hear a lot of those negative messages and they can stick with you for a long time.
yeah,
And I think that that's one of the challenges in as an adult, especially as a newly diagnosed person, that it's okay to
yeah,
stim. After all those years of being told no, you shouldn't.
yeah,
I would suppose that it's a real process just to kind of
yeah,
give yourself permission to
yeah.
stim. Yeah,
Yeah. And I'm finding even around those people from childhood that probably had, no ill intention from it, but didn't realize that told me to suppress my stims, that when I'm around them now, I'm still very self-aware of those behaviors because I was told not to do that. So it's that relationship as well, like, like working on relationships after diagnosis as well. Yeah.
exactly. Right.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you this question. Do you ever explain to people, well, not only about autism, but the need for you to stim or why you stim? I mean, do you ever kind of have discussions with people, neurotypical people, about those types of things?
Yeah, I think more so in university. I lived on campus. So a lot of people around me saw those
Yeah.
sides of me. Like they saw the ins and outs of me and, if they had questions and stuff, I was more than happy to share that information. A lot of the time now, people don't really ask questions. If they did
Hmm.
ask questions, I'd be more than happy to explain why I do the things I do and who I am. I think that's why I partly created my YouTube channel as well, just to share that information, and bring more awareness, especially to like adults diagnosed, and finding themselves through that autism diagnosis. I think, a lot of the comments on YouTube and stuff are saying like, thank you for talking about this, because I think people are a bit,
Exactly.
yeah, a bit afraid to talk about it in real life.
Yeah, and we're going to put a link to your YouTube channel on the podcast notes so people can check that out
Yeah,
if they
thank
want
you.
to. What are some of the ways you've come to accept or even celebrate your stims as a meaningful part of who you are?
Yeah, I think I celebrate them by just being like they've brought a lot of sense to my life.
Yeah.
A lot of understanding and knowing, um, growing up that it was, I was different, but that's okay. And how the stims make me feel, it's a positive thing because they help me regulate. They're just another expression of my emotion. Autism is a part of who I am, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And I think as I go through that journey now as a parent of an autistic child, that is becoming more clear to me, and I just celebrate that. Like, autism is part of her, and we have our really hard days. There's a lot of
Right.
struggles with that, but she's a very unique person, and there's a lot of strengths to her as well. So I think it has brought a lot of like sense and achievement, like, and just knowing who I am as a person, if that makes sense.
It does. And I like how you mentioned the word strengths because I think that when we have conversations about autism, I
Yeah,
think too often we're just kind of looking at the negatives or those types of things. But autistic people are people. I mean,
yeah,
we all have strengths and things that we challenges, things that we could work on. But
yeah,
certainly, it's we shouldn't overlook the strengths that autistic people have as well. So I like
yeah,
that you brought that up. Well, I'm going to ask you a sort of an interesting question here. Um, if your stims could speak for you,
yeah.
if they could tell the world something about who you are without having to say a word, what do you think they'd say?
I think they'd say childlike, carefree, unique. I did actually have a discussion with my partner about stimming,
Uh,
after we discussed doing this podcast
yeah.
together. And I said, what do you think of my stims? Like when I say that word to you, what do you think of? And he said, happy flappy woman. And I was
I
like,
love
yeah.
that. That's wonderful. That's
Yeah. So
awesome.
yeah. Yeah.
Well, is there any words of wisdom, any advice you have for people who are listening to the podcast? Because we have lots of different people. We have people
Okay.
who have been diagnosed as autistic, some who self-identify as autistic,
Yeah.
some who are kind of contemplating going through the diagnosis and the evaluation
Yeah.
process. Any words of advice or wisdom that you have for our listeners?
I think just trusting in yourself, trusting deep down, you know who you are, um, you know your struggles, you know your strengths, and just trying to build that understanding and building that information for you, so you can get the most out of your life, really. Whether that's seeking a diagnosis or not, some people just have that, even just having that knowledge, or just yeah, I think just having that knowledge and being positive about stuff because there are struggles.
Yeah.
Having autism is a part of me, but it is also it's been very difficult throughout my life. But I'm just taking the positives of that and understanding how my brain works and trying to
Hmm.
help myself as much possible whilst educating. So I think just trust the process, trust that
Hmm.
you know you, and just work from there, really.
That's
Yeah.
great advice. I love
Yeah.
that. Well, if people want to learn more about you and maybe your YouTube channel, how can they check you out?
Yep, so I've got my YouTube. I have actually got a book as well,
Okay.
that can be purchased on Amazon. I wrote it as a teenager, battling mental health problems. And it is quite interesting to read for me now because I wrote that before I knew I was autistic.
Oh,
So
okay.
it is very interesting to read, and I am trying to work on another book now that I know about my diagnosis.
That is
Um,
awesome.
yeah, I have got a blog. I haven't posted on there for a long time, but there's quite useful information on there, so I'm more than happy to send you the link.
Sure.
But I am working on getting my YouTube back up and running a bit more frequently now.
Yeah.
It's been very tricky with my little girl.
Oh, I totally understand. Life
Yeah,
happens. I totally get
yeah.
that.
But there are a lot of videos on there from a couple of years and stuff like that. So if people are at the start of their journey or they just want a little more information, there are quite a lot of people in the comments as well that are sharing their experiences. So that is a good base if people want to start exploring things.
And the name of your book that
Yep.
you wrote a few years
It's
ago, what's the name of that?
it's called Smiling Through Recovery.
Smiling Through Recovery. Okay,
Yeah.
that's great. Well, Savannah, thanks so much for joining me today and talking about this. I think this will be a real popular episode for people to
Oh, thank you
listen
for having
to.
me. I've really
Yeah,
enjoyed the experience.
and you have a good rest of the week.
Perfect. You too. Thank you.
Thank you.